All right, guys, now let's take the silver method and go a little bit deeper. I'm gonna have you follow along with me as I've gone through that process to create the Welly Wisher Sloper. This will be fun and it'll feel a little bit like you're just kind of watching over my shoulder. So come on, let's go. Let's get this sloper made. All right, to start this process, you can see what I have sitting in front of me. I've got a Welly Wishers doll. I have measuring tape. I have a seam gauge, which just helps me do some smaller measurements. I have a pencil, eraser. I have tape. I also have design line tape, which is on this doll, which is a very narrow tape that actually is similar to like painter's tape, and you can find this a lot of places. I also found this, which is a tape that is like a measuring tape. It's in sections of 10 centimeters, which is great if you are familiar with centimeters or if you just want to use it and then convert to inches once you're done. But it's a great way to place the tape on the doll and get an exact measurement for what you're trying to do. So I also have some graph paper and my foil pieces. So these are very rough foil pieces. I think if you're looking at these, you're probably trying to figure out what shapes these are even supposed to be. But I have this one here in the center is half of a back, and then this other half is not really part of the piece. So it's just from the center over. And then I have a bodice front, and I'm using one side of it and then just mirroring it for both sides. And then I also have a sleeve. So we'll move forward with these first three parts and then we'll touch on the skirt and the pants. Now my first suggestion when making any new sloper would be to do all the measurements, go down your measurement sheet and do all the measurements of the new doll. Look at the existing slopers that we have and compare your measurements, because it's a lot easier if you have a starting point. So if you have a sloper that's close, and in this case we have the Hearts for Hearts doll and the Welly Wishers doll, they're similar in size but not exactly the same. So the Welly Wisher is a little bit taller, she's a little bit broader in the shoulders and the hips, and she also has a little bit stockier legs with a shorter inseam. So there's a few differences that we'll need to work through. But I can build my new sloper using my existing Hearts for Hearts sloper as a guide to just make sure that I'm making the measurements and the corrections in the correct places. Now, if you're building your sloper completely from scratch, you'll want to just make sure that you're using something like graph paper and that you have a very nice straight line that you have so that you're setting your angles and your measurements all based on perpendicular lines. And I've just done this with my pencil, my ruler on my graph paper lines, and that kind of gives me a starting point. So when I'm ready to build my bodice sloper, I'm going to set my center front and my waistline center front right in this corner, and then I'll work to match my measurements and trace my piece based on a squared starting point. Now for this illustration, I have the Hearts for Hearts sloper printed out, I have my graph paper, and I have my foil pieces. So I also am going to use tracing paper, and this is the method that I like to use so that I can easily make changes by having the translucent paper, so I can lay it on top of a piece over an existing piece if I need to make adjustments or changes. So I have my graph paper centered underneath. And then for this example, I'm actually going to take my Hearts for Hearts sloper and I'm going to set it right in there, and I can see my squared lines on my graph paper meeting this center front neckline and the waistline. So now I'm taking my bodice front piece that was molded on this doll, and you can see on this doll I have my marking lines. This is her bust line, this is her waistline. So from here up I'm working on the bodice, and from here down I'm working on the skirt and the pants. And then I have that all the way around her waistline, so it's marked, and I can use that to match my measurements and just check my fit. So I have my foil piece that is a general outline of where her neckline, shoulder, and the depth of her arm's eye will be. And I'm actually just going to set this on top of my Hearts for Hearts sloper. And I'm just going to notice that you can see from here the depth of her arm's eye is probably the biggest change. She has a larger arm than the Hearts for Hearts. The Hearts for Hearts has a skinnier, narrow arm. So that comes down. And the side seam right here from the foil is matching her curve of her side, so there is no dart. So we're going to adjust this to be straight, and then we'll include the dart in the center of this bodice front piece. So you won't have an angled side seam. We're going to pull that out straight. So it will extend slightly past the original Hearts for Hearts. Then you'll also notice up here, her center front neckline is slightly higher, and then it will curve around, and she has a slightly larger shoulder. So this just comes up above and is extending a little bit past the shoulder, which also extends the arm's eye on the top as well as on the bottom. So for my first step, I'm just going to work through lightly tracing this on here. And I'm just going to go like this. I'm going to match down here, and I'll use my ruler to create a straight seam on that side. And then I just am tracing this outline. Then I'm just going to square off my edges here. And I'm going to make note of this dart. This here is about 1/4 of an inch, which is how much I'm going to extend my original curve, which was about right here. So if we come out on the side, we're going to extend that there, and then we're going to include the dart here. And on this sloper, it's actually the same size, so that's fine, and we can use these same points. I'm going to measure the height right here and just make sure that from her waist to her bust point is the same as the Heart for Heart doll. She might actually have a little bit shallower of a depth. I believe the Welly Wisher waistline is a little bit higher. The Hearts for Hearts doll has a little bit longer torso. The nice thing about this too is that I can use this to kind of begin my marks for my notches. So I have a notch point here, and I will work with the sleeve and make sure that I have the notches in the same place, and then we'll come back and do these measurements to make sure that they all line up. So here you can see I have this traced over this Hearts for Hearts size. Now I'm just going to look at my bodice back and see how much difference there is in that as well. So I have this piece right here, and I have my center back point marked right here. So I can do the same thing by lining this up. And looking at the shape difference on this one. And the foil on this one is a little bit more torn. It's a little bit more uneven. So this one we're definitely going to want to go through and make sure that we have the measurements from her body at these points as well. But this is a good starting point. Now I can remove this paper and I can just begin working with my actual pieces. Now this right here is actually my original first drawing of these sloper pieces, and I'm just redoing that method right here so you can see what I'm doing. But this is my bust point, and then that front dart that goes up to the bottom edge of that bust point perimeter circle. So I have those marked here with just some tiny little dots, and I'm actually just going to go in and measure to make sure that I'm happy with where this sits. So if I have this up, it is 1.5 inches from her waistline, and I'm looking at the doll, and I'm measuring, and I'm using the top edge of this blue tape as the base of my bodice piece. So I have 1.5 inches up, and that is the center point of her bust line. And then I'm just going to have the circle around that be 2/8 of an extension around, and then our bust dart will come up to that point. So when I come back over here, I've got that 1.5 inches to my bust point, and then 2/8 of an inch down. And I'm just going to do that all the way around to create my circle. And I can check this with a variety of tools. You can set something like this at 2/8 and make little markings all the way around. And you can use your compass to draw a perfect circle that has the right extension around that bust point. So then at that point, we're just going to come back in here and add our dart lines back in. And the slight extension at the bottom, and then we have a bodice sloper. Now keep in mind, this bodice front sloper has no seam allowances, so we'll have to go through the process all the way around on the sides, the shoulder seams, the sides, and this arm's eye with a 1/4 inch seam allowance so that we can test the fit. You don't have to add the seam allowance to the neckline or that waistline for this part of the process. You can do that if you're testing out how your hem will be, or where your waistband or your waistline join placement is going to be, and you want to sew pieces together. But for this, we're just going to add 1/4 inch seam allowance on the side, the arm's eye, and this shoulder seam. Now, one other tip, if I do have my graph paper, or I'm drawing this straight on graph paper and your lines are 1/4 inch, then that is a fast and easy process. If your lines match up, you can always slide this over a little bit. I have my side seam, it's a little bit past my 1/4 inch line. So I'm just going to move that so that it's out a little bit. So I have my seam line is going to be here, and then I need my seam allowance line to come out 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to draw these lines long enough so that as I come around, I'll find the cross points, and then I can trim my seam allowance. Then for the shoulder seam, we're just going to mark our points. And this is all the same process that we've shown you in the Pattern Academy when you're working through adding seam allowance, changing design lines, anything like that. So you're going to go through that process. Now I'm just going to go ahead and repeat that on my bodice back, and then we're going to move on to our sleeve. Now for the sleeve on this bodice, this is one of the biggest differences with these two doll types. So I have my Hearts for Hearts one basically as a guide, but I know this is too long and narrow, the arm size too small. So we're going to work through that with our pieces and draft a piece that fits this doll. So you can look just as comparing these two together. You can see that the Hearts for Hearts doll in the back, that her arm comes down a little bit longer, and that the span across the top of her shoulder from the side is narrower on the Hearts for Hearts doll. The Wellie Wisher has a little bit bigger shoulder and a little bit thicker, shorter arm. So I'm going to look back at my measurements sheet, and I'm going to check my measurement of the arm length from that shoulder point all the way down to her wrist. And here it's a little bit, it's about 4 1/4. So I know that that is the length from the top of the cap of that sleeve all the way down to her wrist. And then the other part that is pretty important is from that front bodice seam around her arm to the back. So this is just under 2 inches, and that's pretty tight. So if we know we want to have a little bit of space, even so her arm can just move a tiny bit for that sloper, then that's probably about a 2 inch span right there that reaches around her shoulder. And you can see here on this Hearts for Hearts doll, when we spin her around to the back, it's a little bit less than 1 3/4 inches. So this part right here is a much smaller span than we need for the Welly Wisher. Then I'm going to take that measurement. I'm looking at the Hearts for Hearts sloper just to kind of give myself a guide point as to where I'm going to need to make that adjustment. So right here we have 1 3/4 inch across, and this basically goes from notch to notch. So I'm looking at that piece. That is the part that wraps around her shoulder, and then from here up, this is the part that's curving over and meeting that shoulder seam right across from the neckline. So here is my foil piece, and this is pretty rough. I'm really just using this side off to the left, and I'm looking at when I wrapped this around her arm, and I was really just looking for that depth of the shoulder, the cap right here, and where it needs to come around to meet under her arm's eye. So I have this piece flattened out. I'm looking at it here compared to a piece that I have that I know is going to be similar. And I'm noticing right away that this sleeve is a different shape. It has a shorter length. It has a wider, longer arm's eye depth. So we're going to need to make those adjustments and just determine where we want that to sit. So I'm back at my graph paper and I have my line drawn on here. I'm going to set my sleeve so that that center point of the cap is at the top lined up, and I have my sleeve sitting straight. So down here is going to be that wrist point line, and then up here is my shoulder. And I'm just going to start by tracing what I have, and then we're going to go through and work through really perfecting this shape. So if I traced out my sleeve, and I'm squaring off my edges a little bit here, and I'm going to come down to this point, and then I'm going to use this and I'm going to mirror it on my other side. So for now I have half that sleeve point, and I can actually just take my paper, I can fold it right here on this line, I can trace what I started with, and then when I open that up, I can actually see right through. So here I have my piece, and I have it mirroring sides laid out flat. Now just as a guide here, I'm going to just draw a very faint line down the middle, and then I am also going to measure where those notches would be. So on my bodice sloper, I have a point at which I'm turning this along this line until I see where my notch is. So I have that just before 3/4 inch. So I'm going to bring that over to my sleeve, and I'm just going to roll right up this line until I'm just before 3/4 inch. And this is where my front notch will be. And then I'm just going to transfer that marking on the back side. Now I'm going to look at this measurement right across my notches, which on the doll, that span around her arm was about 2 inches. So this looks good. At this point, we have a 2-inch span from the front side to the back side. Then I'm also just going to check this measurement down at the bottom. Right now, I have 3 inches right here, and I need to be sure that this is going to fit around her fingers. So not just her wrist, but the points at which her thumb and her finger are. I need to make sure that I can slip something that is 3 inches in a circle over her hand. Her wrist measurement is just 2 1/4 inches, but if I measure around this point of her fingers, it's more like 2 1/2. So this sloper is pretty straight cut. It's 3 inches across, which is a pretty generous sleeve. So if we want to do any shaping on that sleeve for the pattern design, we know that we have a little bit of space to either taper it or create something different, but this is a very nice straight sleeve that will fit right up over her arm. Now I'm just going to go through and add seam allowance to this piece so that I can test the fit of the bodice, front, back, and sleeve on the doll.